I believe we need worldviews to inspire us and seduce us and entice us into new worlds.
Welcome to the Regeneration Will Be Funded. I'm your host, Matthew Monahan, and in this series, we're having conversations about regenerative finance, technology, and our living planet. How can we build an economy that's in service to life? Brought to you by Ma Earth. You can find all of our conversations at maearth.com. Thanks for joining us. Today's guest is Alexa Firmenich. Alexa is an author, poet, wilderness guide, researcher, investor, philanthropist, and podcast host. Throughout all of her work and expressions, Alexa is in deep service to bringing human society into harmony with Earth. In this conversation, we go into topics around biodiversity, drawing from some of Alexa's insightful writings, including considerations around financializing nature. I think it's an important and timely discussion, so let's dive right in with Alexa Firmenich. Welcome. Today we are here with my new friend, Alexa Firmenich. Alexa is the co-director of SEED at Crowther Lab, ETH Zurich. She is the founder and principal at Ground Effect, an Animist investment studio. She's also the host of Lifeworlds, a beautiful podcast series. Welcome, Alexa.
Thank you for having me here.
And you're here at the Planet Local Summit in Bristol. Mm-hmm. What brings you to this gathering?
One of the areas that we would like to deepen our funding into as the years progress, I think we will see a lot of large-scale systems increasingly coming under strain, fragility of various supply chains and whatnot. And I would like to learn more about what does local resiliency, local infrastructure, local placemaking, local governance, what does that look like? And there are a lot of people here who I think I can learn a lot from, who have been doing this work for a long time. Mm. And I myself have lived in quite a few places around the world, but I have a long way to go in my own local engagement with place. So I come here as a humble student of the conference and to try to understand how we can support this movement.
Mm. And you wear many hats in the movement, but you mentioned deepening your funding. And so I take it that's part of the context of Ground Effect. I'm curious if you can unpack a bit more of what is Ground Effect and what is an Animist investment studio?
Yeah, we've been quite deliberate with that up front. I see a lot of so ours is a family office. It's part of my family's capital, but you see a lot of different funds and family offices and investment vehicles out there that their ethos is geared towards a problem that they're solving, right? Mm-hmm. It's like a net zero fund or a decarbonization or... Mm-hmm. I believe we need worldviews to inspire us and seduce us and entice us into new worlds. And so since I was a young girl, for me, the closest I've had to a belief system or faith or religion, whatever you want to call it, is one of the terms that could be called animism. But there's other names for it in different cultures. And it was pre-verbal. It was just when I was a child, I saw everything in the world as alive and sentient and wise and intelligent and astounding and part of me. And so in some places around the world, that's called animism. It's simply not just a philosophy, but I think a physically felt and embodied understanding that life is sacred, nature, natural beings of all forms are part of a web of life that can be felt, and that conversation can be practiced and should be practiced. And so for me, animism is a belief system, a practice, a felt ontology, a felt way of being. And so I deliberately put that into the sort of opening line, if you will, of what we do with our investments, because it's a worldview that kind of like, I guess, the valleys of a river and the waterfalls, but it structures anything that I do in my life.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah. And so the vehicle itself is it's a mix of grants and for-profit investments. We are completely tool agnostic as long as it makes sense, and I think advances a different logic of economics and care for life in the world.
Well, I have many questions about it, but I also want to, touch on this frame that you mentioned about animism being a practice. And I understand you've been a wilderness guide and facilitator. Can you tell me more about that side of your background as well?
It always feels so funny to speak about being a wilderness guide when like my hair's done and I'm like, wearing normal clothes in a conference context. But so when I was living in Mexico, which was for most of my 20s, I started working a lot with local NGOs and some of the largest NGOs of the country, always in the environment. Nature was always my thing. And my thing, it was, what I was in service to and in reverence of. And I would always go to visit projects around the country, and I would take a break on either side of those visits, either before or after, and just explore the land and stay with random communities and speak with people and understand just what made the place tick. And because I do a lot of writing and photography, I would then exhibit works in Mexico City. Mm. And friends of mine who were in the business community or political community or investors would tell me, you are seeing parts of my country that I don't even know. Can I come with you? Mm. And I would say, well, if you want to come with me, you're doing it my way, which is often like we have a tent, we're camping, we're like on the ground, like it's, and for me, that's really important. And so around the same time, one of my best friends quit her job in Macquarie, a big asset manager. And we decided to start a company that was, because these little trips that I started doing informally became so successful in creating this animist, I guess, feeling in the people I was traveling with. I would bring a business friend and they would come, and after 3 days would be like, oh, how can I support the jungle? Or like, I can't believe we're doing this with plastics or whatever it was. I was like, these learning journeys or these embodied experiences are incredibly effective. Mm-hmm. So we started a company called Atlas Unbound that was active for about 2.5, 3 years. We brought about 150 people on these journeys in different parts of Mexico, and one in Europe and one in Guatemala. And these were 4 or 5 day journeys with very different structures, and learned a lot as we went. I can get into that if you'd like. But about the second or third journey, I was like, actually, if something happens with a scorpion, I don't know what to do. Or if someone falls off a cliff, like, I need to be responsible. So I took the official Mexican national training of Semarna, which is to be a wilderness guide. And parallel to that, all the different first aid courses. And then Outward Bound had a regenerative tourism diploma, which I also took. So that was, I trained in order to, if push comes to shove, hopefully be a little bit accountable to the people whose lives were entrusted in my hands.
Beautiful. So you mentioned living all around the world, including that experience in Mexico, and now you're in Switzerland. I would say in the kind of biodiversity field, and which is very much a hot topic in a lot of the discourse. We were just at New York Climate Week, and everyone was referring to it basically as nature. Like, we're moving from climate to nature, which is just kind of a funny way of saying it to begin with, in my opinion. But can you share more about what brought you to Crowther Lab and a bit of the work of Seed?
Absolutely. The group that I represent is awesome. So Crowther Lab has been around for about 4 to 5 years. So we're an interdisciplinary team of ecologists and scientists. I'm a political scientist. These are more ecologists. 40 or so of us studying ecosystems on a global scale to understand the relationships between climate and biodiversity, so carbon. We're housed inside of ETH Zurich, which is kind of like Europe's MIT. You can say it's like very engineering and science intensive. A lot of the research has enabled the understanding of the carbon capture potential of the global restoration movement, And things like, nematodes, you know what they are? Nematodes.
Explain it, please.
A nematode is a little animal. It's like a little worm that lives in the soil. It's 4 out of 5 of all animals on Earth are nematodes. And not that many people care about nematodes, but you're alive because they exist. And we map the distribution of global nematodes. So we basically create these large-scale global maps of ecological patterns and then see relationships between them. We have an amazing few papers coming out this year on connectivity and ecological functionality of, do you need lots of small or large patches to be connected for ecosystems to function more optimally? So the lab has been around for a few years doing this core research. It's already spun out 2 startups. And when I met Tom, who's become a dear friend, the founder of the lab a year and a half ago, they were looking to start this initiative called SEED, which I'm now co-directing. And we are creating the world's most comprehensive measure of biodiversity for any location on the planet. And there's a lot to say about that. And I guess referring back to what you said earlier, carbon, even though it's a mistake, can often be seen as a single unit. Although a unit of carbon that comes from a tree is very different to a unit of carbon that comes from algae, but we trade them and as if they were fungible.
How are they different?
They arise out of different natural ecosystems. And so the notion of fungibility is potentially dangerous there because it's not actually one for one, even though the molecule itself is the same. A complaint or maybe a escape hatch for those who are in certain positions of corporate or political power has been that we can't measure or understand nature, and so it's really hard for us to restore, repair, protect, penalize. The way that global measurement system or base layer is created will affect everything about how these markets are developed. What you measure will be implicated in all of the downstream effects. Now, any act of measurement, I believe, kind of kills nature, and any act of measurement is a reduction. You take this incredible, infinite complexity and you put a pin on it, and that's already a mistake. But we exist inside of this current system, which does this atrociously so. And so with the lab, the question that made me want to join was, can we create the most holistic and comprehensive and living and ongoing measure of biodiversity in order to avoid the worst versions of reductionism that are already happening with some of the current measures that are out there? So that's what we're building. I can speak more about the science or whatever would be interesting to hear. But essentially, a narrow range of values or metrics means that you will optimize for those and externalize harm into all the other systems. So as much as you can bring in those other systems into the calculation, we can do our best. On a personal note, this has been probably the hardest role I've ever held in my life. I am constantly philosophically and spiritually challenged by it. I come from being a woman that was bringing people into the wilderness to feel the infinite sacredness of everything and running investments that are about connecting to the inherent value of life into the most mechanical, quantified, map-based system that exists. And so why did I do that? I think first off, I would like to understand better that system from the inside and see what is possible and not possible inside of it. And having a front row seat to the emergence of biodiversity companies, credits, markets, where the thing that I'm the most in love with, which is nature, biodiversity, meets the kind of superorganism destructive force that is global finance and capitalism or neoliberal capitalism, where those two come together, that edge. I chose to place myself in the middle of this. And it can sometimes feel like a compromise. And so I have to really remain honest to myself.
I want to go deeper on some of those things around the measurement. And to me, this is like some of the core questions that this field of people in the environmental space are really grappling with, and something that we've talked a lot about on this interview series, especially in the carbon context. But first, also want to ask you, when people hear the word biodiversity, maybe a starting frame is like, how many different species? Help me understand a bit more how you experience this word and what's behind the word and why it's so important.
Where to start? So, for me, the most kind of one of the most evocative ways for people who might want to just have a more felt sense of the term is that do you know the polyphonic music? Does this mean something to you?
No.
It's like the Balkan chants, or it's essentially you have many different voices, and they come together to create a chorus, and they all sing in a different tone. But then when they're all together, it's polyphonic music, and it's beautiful. And many ancient cultures had polyphonic music, a polyphony of voices.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, biodiversity is that infinite layering of all of these different voices or expressions of life. And the emergent result is what we see as physical objects, as units of nature. But they are composed almost of these sound waves, if you will, or these invisible threads that are everything from genetic processes to, weather and erosion. And so for me, biodiversity is the immeasurable relationships that constitutes the points that you see that then becomes an ecosystem. So that's one way that I would understand biodiversity. The technical definition is you have genetic species and genetic species and ecosystem level diversity. A fourth one that I advocate to be added for, and I think some of the people I've had on my podcast speak about, is cultural diversity. So other beings have cultures, and that actually really influences the functioning of ecosystems. But the CBD, conventional biological diversity definition, only has the first three. So I would also add cultural diversity. So did that answer your question about what biodiversity is?
I think so.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. And, we often hear the frame, we're losing 200 species a day.
Mm-hmm.
But can you say more about the current state of what's happening on the planet vis-a-vis biodiversity?
Well, this made me think to your previous question. If we just measure species, we're going to get it wrong.
Mm-hmm.
After a clear cut, you can maybe get a boost of species because you have all the pioneer species that are repopulating the ecosystem.
Mm-hmm.
And so again, what you measure for, you will optimize for, and that optimization will drive a new form of extinction in the system because you're not accounting for the other variables.
Mm-hmm.
So if you just think of biodiversity, species count, proximity to a protected area, and not to mention that most of the existing metrics don't look at below ground diversity, fungal, microbial. And so that misses a whole parts on the map, actually.
Mm-hmm. And you have a brilliant visualization of this. I saw you presented at the Nature Finance webinar recently. Can you share more about this?
Mm-hmm. If you look at above ground species count or species abundance, you get a much more rich distribution in the middle latitudes, in the tropics, let's say, right? In the center of the Earth. Imagine you're seeing a map and it's red. If you look at below ground diversity, so what I mentioned earlier, those nematodes, you actually have much higher distributions in the northern latitudes, in the boreal almost at the top. So the world map would be red on the top. If you look at functional traits, if you look at genetic divergence, if you look at each map is different. So with seed, if you imagine what we're trying to do is stack as many of those maps as possible, and then you actually bring them together in a very sexy sounding process called dimensionality reduction approach, and you stack all the maps together. Yeah, right. It's a good word. Just showing off now. And all of those coming together will give you a much more different weighted distribution of biodiversity. To your second question, what's happening to biodiversity on the planet? I mean, where to begin, right?
You wrote a beautiful essay called "Extinction is Loneliness." Maybe you could begin there.
Yeah, I think I have been attuned to loneliness because I was quite a lonely child, and so we always see the world through our lenses. And I read 2 books at this. I was reading 2 books. Sometimes it's really fun to read 2 books at the same time that are kind of different, but and then it creates new things in your brain. I don't think I could have written this piece without these 2 books. So one was Other Lands, and the other one was The Secret Teachings of Plants by Stephen Bunner. And both of those books in their own way speak to the intensely entangled, multi-million year interdependencies between species. A bee and a flower, right? This uniqueness that, imagine, like, and I guess this is what I wrote in the article, and bringing it back to extinction, I began experiencing extinction through the lens of these 2 books as a very lonely, a deeply heartbreakingly lonely process. Because, like, if you can imagine that 400 million years ago, you are a insect or some underwater fish, and you have a body, and that body, like, is taking its form over thousands of years of evolution to match an ecosystem or a mate or a feeding partner, or your body is physically, like, you're constructed to fit into a niche, right? Like, imagine what that actually feels like. And then, like, 400 million years of a relationship with someone, and all of a sudden they're gone, right? You said 200 species a day. We don't even know.
Right.
But it's just a death of a million cuts. And so imagine what it's like to no longer have that counterparty there at all. And you've been so, you've perfected your capacity so deeply that you can't keep up with the pace. Like, what's fascinating about humans is we create these extracorporeal, these out-of-body abstractions, like these recursive abstractions that you can call culture or tools, but they allow us to completely bypass the genetic, epigenetic, even mutations that other species use to maintain in some kind of balance. Use a conscious process or not, pick your your belief system, but we've skipped that. And so our exponential curve drives that exponential destruction, and the bodies and relationships of other species can't keep up. Migratory patterns. Imagine you've flown for 200 years knowing where to land, and every time you landed, those crabs came out for those 2-3 days, and all of a sudden you land and the crabs don't come, or you trying to land and it's gone. So for me also, it's this notion of home, right? Like, every human understands that you need a home, and these creatures have no homes left, nowhere to go. So for me, the notion of extinction is not like biodiversity loss or a statistic that is just numbing. I think in like communication around this moment, and in our activism, and in our everything we do, like, we have to convey the best that we can what it may feel like to be maybe the counterparty or the being that's experiencing that death and that loss.
And a lot is made of fossil fuel emissions contributing to climate change. What would you frame as kind of the key activities that are contributing to this loss of biodiversity?
So there's the surface level ones and there's the deeper ones, right? The surface level ones, the largest one is agriculture, how we grow and produce our food and transport our food, which itself is a huge carbon source of GHG emissions. So just land use change in general. We don't need to get into here why agriculture, but I think people understand the massive monocultures. And pollution is a very big one. And we're seeing the effects of forever chemicals and microplastics. And it's interesting, like, plastics in the ocean for me are like a very slow oil spill because they're also made from oil. And so it's like this is also fossil fuel pollution. Urbanization, food, fuel, and fiber. So trees and, what we're growing, and also energy. So things like biofuels. So that's kind of the surface level, why we're destroying nature. What's underneath that is something you probably talk a lot about on your show, right? Which is the sort of, I'm trying to find the right word for it, but it's the embedded growth obligation of the global economy and the kind of, abstraction, extraction, necessity, because we need to grow a certain percentage every year, and that is built on the backs of billions of years of ecological debt now that have been taken from the living world.
Mm. Okay, so at Seed, you said you're trying to create the most comprehensive measurement of biodiversity. Why?
The last 2-3 years, but especially last year, has seen a massive swell of financial commitments and political commitments to restoring and protecting global biodiversity. So in December last year in Montreal, you had the Kunming-Montreal Agreement. 96 countries signed up to about 15, 16 targets. And one of those is 30 by 30, so protecting 30% of lands and oceans by 2030. How are you going to measure that? What's being protected? One of them is mandatory disclosures for corporations on their impacts on nature. So these multinational companies that many of them don't know at all their supply chains or where they're sourcing from over the next years are somehow going to have to figure out what their impacts are on nature, kind of like a scope 1, 2, 3 thing for carbon. That needs to be measured and understood. You need global maps. So those are kind of those commitments. And you have massive financial commitments. So redirecting of reverse subsidies, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of banks and asset managers are attempting to do the right thing and create new financial products around nature, or biodiversity, I should say. And so all of that needs a measurement system of some shape and form. So that's what we're trying to create, and then you can kind of build anything off that.
Got it. So my experience of the carbon markets in New Zealand, which anyone watching this show gets to hear me rant and rave about extensively, it's kind of like this petri dish because we only have 5 million people. And it's, I just feel very schizophrenic because on the one hand, it's reduced deforestation, the introduction of this emissions trading scheme. But on the other hand, we're witnessing in real time a lot of really bad decisions about land use get made because of these interventions of this singular metric focus on carbon, what that's doing to incentivize monocrop eucalyptus pine plantations that are not native and are causing all sorts of downstream consequences, not the least of which is hollowing out of the biodiversity of life that really wants to emerge in these places. And so, there's like 2 ways to respond. One, simplistically is like, get better at measuring it. We should start measuring below ground carbon. We should start updating the incentive structures to recognize the value of native species and diversity. We should bring in cultural premiums, if you will, for tree species that are important to the people of these communities, of these lands. And like, how do we improve and iterate these measurement systems so that we're in greater harmony with nature? And then there's another response, which is just like, this is just the wrong approach. Like, we've had 7 or 8 years in a highly educated, cohesive, context where people understand a lot about the ecology and conservation. I mean, New Zealand's by no means perfect, as I'm stating, but is fairly advanced in these conversations relative to many countries. And so, is the very act of what we're trying to do just the wrong approach? And I guess I start with that frame because now the discourse is moving into, from very good intentions for the most part that I see, which is, okay, we don't want to have carbon tunnel vision. We don't want to build these financial mechanisms to only measure and track one incentive structure around carbon. We need to look at biodiversity. We need to look at the complexity of life and the habitat loss and destruction that's happening, and think about this more holistically. And yet, we're now starting with, in some circles, the efforts to create market-based totalizing metrics that create these tradable, fungible credits that risk possibly even more damage than what carbon did because it's so easy to get it wrong. So how are you grappling with these different considerations? I know it's very much a big part of your inquiry. You wrote an essay also called Selling Nature in Order to Save It, ? Where you touched on some of these themes. But yeah, I'm curious what that brings up for you and your comments.
This goes back to what I said a little while ago about the massive tension in the middle of this work. So the way I currently understand it, which is changing often, is we have like triage, transition, and transformation. And we have 3 scales of time, and obviously multiple scales of time, and spiritually, who knows, but different people are called to different parts of this work, this massive global work that entails all hands on deck in a million ways, right? I, for some reason in this lifetime, seem to like to operate and need to operate between all 3. Triage is, what do we need to do right now? Keep the lights on so that, as much as we would like to reform this entire global economic system, if we don't do that wisely, who will be the people who suffer the most? People whose pension funds are invested in public equities and so on and so forth. There will be, I believe, no smooth transition. I don't think there can be because of the way that power works, or is currently held. But we can make it less painful. So for me, triage is, what do we do today to ensure in these, 10, 15 years to come that are incredibly critical for biodiversity and all of the communities living close to the land? Then transition for me is, okay, when we look at these triage actions, what is implicitly embedded in them that we're either seeing or not seeing? And how can we architect those immediate solutions? Or I don't like the word solutions, because there's no it's not the right word. How can you architect those immediate interventions or responses? Yeah. I like this word, in order to not create, the problems that are, every solution creates its own problems. All of these kinds of quotes, and can't solve a problem from the same mindset that created it. Of course, yes, I think these are almost too cheesy to repeat, but can we build in the triage actions the seeds of the transition that I think I would long to see? And then for me, transformation is like global consciousness change, let's say, not one, multiple. There's a multiplicity, there's a polyphony of consciousness changes that will happen, embedded in their unique contexts. So when it comes to the markets around nature, and in this piece, Selling Nature in Order to Save It, the first thing I would say is that ideally, governments and financial institutions, and where most of the global money is held, or not to mention the richest 1%, would just do unidirectional payments, or a kind of nature UBI, universal basic income, whatever you want to call it. Some people call it conservation basic income. We just resend capital right now back to where it belongs, in the land, with no expectation of return. And that could be global tax, redistribution. We're talking about global governance here, like a completely different tax incentive structure reform. As much as I would love to see this, I know people have been working tirelessly on this for their entire lives, and they're 17 still doing it. It's not. I would love for it to happen quicker, and I think that's why we need to fund activists and people on the front lines. But it's not happening fast enough, in my opinion. And so these markets exist. And in this piece I wrote, I speak about like 4 main problems that can emerge from nature markets, right? And one is ecological. So there's this amazing book that you should read called Streams of Revenue. And it speaks about the first ecosystem service markets that emerged initially in the US around wetland mitigation, and how the way that the compensation schemes were structured literally reformed the hydrology of the US into these very constricted linear river that actually couldn't take form and move and be organic like rivers like to move. They were so if you create the wrong systems, you will create a mechanical nature that will be destructive. So these are ecological issues with these markets. Behaviorally, it's been shown that when you replace an intrinsic reason for doing something with with an extrinsic motive, it erodes the intrinsic motives such that they often can't be brought back. And there's a lot of behavioral economics around this that would be too long to get into here. But Dan Ariely, my dear friend, has written quite a bit about this. And then you have sort of, I would call the spiritual mistake, which is if I'm paying you to do this, like where is the spirituality in this? Like what right do we have to impose any price on any other living being? And then socially, it can be a new extractive system of a globalized north towards communities on the ground. So people are saying, okay, well, you can embed that any time a credit trades via blockchain or whatever, that 70 to 80% of that trade goes back to the local population. So you can maybe embed different obligations into some of these credit schemes, and obviously co-design some of them with communities. And at the end of the day, we can't sit here in Bristol and say what the Mayan communities might want, right? In the Mexican jungle, like I know some of them don't want carbon credits, and some of them are like, we want it. It's not for us to impose our system in that way, although the system has already been imposed for thousands of years. So it's a super strange tension. I sense that it'll be useful for a little while to get a little bit of money towards it, but I wouldn't want to spend too much attention on it because the deeper structural change is what's really needed. So yes, invest in these products, and I'm doing it myself, but in each of them also, to an equal amount, invest in policy advocacy, all the other things that need to happen. Don't just think it's a solution.
So I want to get to more of those. What do you see as those transformational, structural changes? But within the context of these biodiversity, carbon, ecological credit markets, so what are you seeing emerge in that field? What's got your attention in a positive way? How are you going about this with Ground Effect?
So I'd say there's a few working groups out there that are trying to co-define together what these markets should be. It's been a lot more thoughtful than the carbon markets. It's tried to really learn from this, the movement. There's a few organizations like what Terrasos does, their Colombian mitigation bank, Nature Mitigation Bank. They're incredibly conscious and aware of how they do this. Everything in the space of MRV, monitoring, reporting, verification, it's quite interesting because one of the areas that we fund is scientific research that illuminates the magnificence of life. And so I do believe that even though science is a reduction, it can, everyone, when they understood the mycelial networks, it's like become like the mimetic thing of our time, right? Like the mycelium are connecting us. But this notion that like, oh, there's a wood wide web, the forests are alive, they're speaking to each other, like that came from scientific research. Suzanne Simard, amongst others, and our lab as well, did quite a lot of work in this. But it brings fascination and awe. And so for me, certain aspects of monitoring, reporting, verification can bring us closer to the life worlds, if you will, of other species, animals, or and we start to have a planet that kind of sees itself and is conscious of itself. And there's a very interesting space where it's like, where does artificial intelligence meet the inherent intelligence of all of the life forms that already exist around the planet? How do those relate? How can the artificial intelligence, I don't use the word converse because it's a very tricky ethical territory that I'm actually uncomfortable how quickly some people are moving in this. But how can that decoding enable us to see, for example, the cultural lives of animals and understand that when you remove the matriarch, the whole tribe crumbles. And so you can't just rewild and reintroduce species, into an ecosystem and expect that they'll survive. Like they have lineages, they have knowledge keepers. And technology helps us to see that. So I am not answering your question about biodiversity credits and markets. I'm answering your question around the sensors that could exist around the planet to help us understand more about the Earth. And yeah, there's a bunch of very cool biodiversity credit market things out there. But the credit schemes are very young, very, very young.
Yeah, but picking up steam. Were you in Montreal? Did you go to Montreal? Yeah. I mean, so what was the conversation and the mood like? Over 190 countries agreeing on something that is in and of itself a feat. nonetheless as well to think this agreement on 30% of land and oceans by 2030, quite an ambitious framework to put out there relative to where we stand. Tell me more about just the mood in the space, because it seems like there's a lot of momentum.
Have you seen the way that these global agreements get written?
I read the Kunming-Montreal agreement.
Yeah, but have you know the way that you're in the room?
I've never been in the room.
So if you're there at the conference, you can go in and watch these sort of ambassadors of every country hash it out. It's like, it's so 90s. It's like there's like a Word document, right? It's like literally a Word document, and there's like every single other word almost is in red. And these, oh my God, I have such respect for their work. I could not do it. You know, day and night, these representatives of each nation are hashing out over like one word. It's like transparency. Can be more transparent, less like it's just like every single thing is taken apart and then it's deleted and bracketed. And so that's how the agreement gets put together. It's kind of like slow TV. It's like weirdly thrilling in a very strange way to like sit in that room and just watch them create these agreements that are obviously always imperfect. It's incredibly hard to be in those spaces and feel the reverence and the care of what it is you're actually there for, just like any conference. So you meet wonderful people, but it's, I've always thought, you know, Bruno Latour, sort of, how do you describe him? Cultural anthropologist, philosopher. He speaks of this thing called the Parliament of Objects. It's very animist as well. And, you know, essentially, what if other beings or species could speak on behalf of themselves? So he did a few years ago this speculative design project where he took a bunch of his students and had them create a model UN where they had the voices of oceans or voices of different populations at the UN. So instead of nation states being the only representative of the diversity of other, you know, entities on Earth, well, how does that conversation look different? And I know you've had people from Rights of Nature on the podcast, so, and it's an area that we fund as well. But I do wonder how these large COP conferences and others would be different if you had delegations of people coming in and being like, we're the whales, you know, like what's it like to like, as Tara Martin said on my podcast, like what's it like to like pull up a seat and have a salmon at the table? I would love to see that happen. Actually, maybe we can gather a group of people and like, what's the word, guerrilla, like go in and be the weird zoo that goes into COP. And yeah, I just think we need to be a lot more creative and playful as well in a lot of these conversations.
We had a brilliant conversation with Natalia Green from Global Alliance for Rights of Nature last week, and she told us the story of the frog winning the court case down in Ecuador. Yeah, it's really captures both a felt sense and like an imagination expansion, but also practically speaking is bringing other forms of the living world into our abstractions of legal systems and financial and economics.
It's interesting though, because you have politics for, which is like Rights of Nature, which is, you know, we will speak on behalf of you, because it still implies that we have a right to do this with them. I've been learning a little bit recently about politics with, because animals have politics, you know, like these, for example, like these African wild dogs, they have like quorum when they decide which sites to move to. So they all come together and they kind of debate and, you know, and then like they need a certain amount of the dogs to be there to do this. And then they get quorum and they move and they decide. Wow. And so it's really interesting. Like a lot of animals, I spoke about cultures, they have these decision-making processes. They have their politics. Yeah. And so there's this very interesting space of people being like, and we can put them in the show notes, but like, what is it like to do politics with animals actually? And how do our political, you know, processes come together? So I think that's also quite a fun way to think about it.
Nice. Okay, so because you're so knowledgeable about the topic, I want to get back to kind of the measurement, you know, technical, geeky details around what you're seeing in this biodiversity space. So we have these ambitious, sweeping statements on the global stage now. We have people excited about moving from just carbon markets to biodiversity markets. We need to measure some of these, different aspects of these living systems. So where are we at today in terms of the types of measurements that we're capable of? What are some of the shortcomings that you're noticing? And what are you learning at Seed about ways that we can potentially increase our intelligence or enhance other forms of value to be recognized in these biodiversity measurements?
Pretty good questions in there.
I'm glad you're keeping track.
Yeah, kind of. So the last few years have seen a complete global revolution in how we understand ecosystems and biodiversity. And it's a combination of machine learning, AI, and satellites, essentially. And so what I think is so interesting is like, so I have a Buddhist practice, and it's part of the practice is like consciousness seeing itself, reflected in itself ad infinitum in a way. I often have this image of like the Earth as a globe that has built these little devices reformulated from the Earth itself, and then it goes out and it's like eyes looking at eyes looking at eyes, and it's like the Earth becomes conscious of itself. Right. This is the kind of poetic way of seeing it, right? When you see a satellite. And so I can speak about what we do at the lab and how we do these measurements. Essentially, we, as I mentioned earlier, we would create these global maps of distributions of different ecological phenomena. That often means, actually usually means that you had someone doing ground truth sites. So you maybe had someone sampling in Zimbabwe or wherever, right? People go and they do ground sampling. That then gets extrapolated because it gets correlated with other variables like soil pH or temperature, humidity, to create global distributions. You would think that that's quite inaccurate to like, you've got like 20 countries, you've taken samples, but actually they're quite accurate, these maps, for what can happen. So again, you can build these maps for pretty much anything that you're trying to measure. And so you get these global data layers of global maps built off ground truth sites. Then you combine that with remote sensing satellite information, which gives you changes over time of different things like hyperspectral imagery, like you can see different components inside of the leaves of trees, you can see carbon in the ground. So you correlate those maps, or we are correlating with Seed at least, these maps with the satellite information. And then last but not least, there's this other revolution happening on the ground, which is in monitoring, which I alluded to a little bit earlier. So that's things like, drones and environmental DNA, where you can literally sweep and see who's there according to the genetics.
Can you say a little bit more about that? Because it's maybe less understood.
Absolutely, yeah. Look, I'm not an expert on it, but Nature Metrics are one of the best groups doing it, and we've been collaborating with them, so you should have them on the show. But it's essentially you can scoop the water, all right, and you can, or take a sample of the soil, and you can barcode the genetics, and then you correlate that with the libraries that we know, and you can say, okay, who's here, right? So what's actually here? And it's really cool because if you're just doing species count, you kind of have to be lucky if the jaguar walked past the camera trap or something like this. Whereas with eDNA, you can literally have a much deeper sense of the species that are there. And actually, Nature Metrics are building an eBio Atlas, so it's a nonprofit, as far as I understand the last time I checked, to try and map as much of the world's DNA as possible. Then you have bioacoustics, or like it's a sub-branch of ecoacoustics, and it's essentially looking at the soundscape of ecosystems. You can imagine that a healthy ecosystem has a particular shape, and an ecosystem that is more extinct and silent will have a different shape. And that's very cheap, very easy to use. So a lot of local communities are doing this. And actually the lab, I think it's one of the largest bioacoustic projects in the world that we're doing in Costa Rica, across the whole country, understanding if the diversity has augmented in their payment for ecosystem service sites, because they pioneered some of those markets. So did it work? So the revolution of all of this means that you can track biodiversity across multiple scales and over time, and then understand what different management practices or ecological practices, if you will, if you don't like the word management, what those are doing to ecosystems.
What are you seeing around soil testing and measurement?
This is very hotly debated. I'm not at all an expert in soil science. I would say that I believe that the markets moved ahead too quickly with this in terms of compensating farmers for farming carbon, because for the carbon to really go deep into the soil for long periods of time, you need plants with deep roots, you need much longer processes. So we could have a farmer doing some very beneficial regenerative agriculture practices like no-tilling, et cetera, cover crops. That does start to capture the carbon, but then in one bad harvest or storm, one till it could leave, and then they've been paid for that carbon by someone else emitting.
Mm-hmm.
But there are massive advances happening in the sampling space as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess the reason I highlight it is because back to your first point, like agriculture is such a key part of the land use transformation in a destructive way on the planet, and farmers have such limited economic mobility in most cases to change land management practices. And so these new revenue streams that could come into these communities for, problematic words, but ecosystem services is, in my mind, exciting if we can get it right, but still quite a bit of an uphill battle around the measuring and the reporting.
I mean, I love Lila June. She was one of the first people who came on my podcast, and we shouldn't just be growing food for humans. We should be growing food for our entire web of relations. And so for me, a more biodiverse field is, well, who else is eating here with us, and who else are we making food for? And by their eating and our eating, or the process of growing and eating food, feeding, it's a mutually beneficial feedback loop, because the more that they're around, the more that, so I would just say that I try to see agriculture, I guess, through the animist or whatever lens of who else are we growing food for and why. There are also certain, like the Brazil nut, like there are certain crops that won't grow in a low biodiverse ecosystem. So, like Brazil nuts, as per my understanding, rely on a very specific type of pollinator and etc. So if you are eating particular things that require a biodiverse ecosystem to survive, you are enhancing that. So I think that the more that we can eat a wide variety of foods that require farmers to be growing a wide variety of things and not just like 5 or 6 products, and the more that everyone along the food value chain can ask for more products and the ones that are restoring biodiversity, the better. Do farmers need money right now? Yes, to be transitioning their practices, absolutely. Which is, for me, it's part of triage. It's like if we're paying farmers for doing a more biodiversity enhancing activity on their land, absolutely, because our entire lives are built on their backs, and so just like, let's get more money to the people that we rely on to live.
Yeah. And how do we do it in a way that doesn't just reinforce economies of scale, industrial food system incentives, which is one of my concerns about both carbon and biodiversity markets. We see that in our microcosm of New Zealand, where the amount of additional legal fees and compliance fees and everything else that you add on top of it creates conditions where if you're a small landholder, it's not really worth it. And if you're a larger landholder, or a company operating in large landscapes, then it's both worth it and a competitive advantage that gives you an advantage over those small farmers or those small landholders. And so then it reinforces and reinforces, and you see more consolidation happening. So how do we design these types of financial markets in a way that doesn't do that?
There's a company that we're invested in through a fund. They're called Tamoa. They're in Mexico. And I think that a big problem with global food export markets is that we aren't optimizing those. Those systems are not built for foods that are nutritionally important for local consumption. So it's cacao or coffee, right? But you can't live off this if you're living. So what Tamoa do is they said, maize, beans, pepper, like all of these like basic food goods, like heirloom goods that are just common in Mexico. Let's create a value chain around that and grow identity preserved, climate resilient versions of these traditional crops that are commodity crops. But let's pay farmers extra for that because they're doing all these amazing practices up in the Sierras. And we create a luxury product out of that we then sell to Mexico and the States, like best markets, chefs, etc. Chefs are amazing in this movement, by the way. But a portion, and the company kind of mandates this, that the portion of those fields is for local consumption, so that the farmers are not just selling organic coffee so we can eat our nice, have our nice coffees here in Bristol and feel good about ourselves. Well, they then go to the super and they buy Coca-Cola because right. So having that, growing the same crops for export that make local communities or support them in being healthy, I think is an important lens. And obviously that means a high biodiverse diet.
Yeah. And you see that intervention happening through policy levels?
I have not seen it happen through policy level, but it may very well exist. I don't know. Yeah.
So getting back to the measuring about biodiversity, one point that you made in some of your writing that I thought was really articulate and important was that just applying quantitative measurements doesn't get at it alone. And you referenced the jaguar. Can you tell me more about this?
It's a great way to hand over the question.
Yes.
You referenced the jaguar. Listen, guys, cliffhanger. So when I was was it for my wilderness training guide? No, but it was with my same teacher. We visited a community in the foothills it's where Oaxaca meets Veracruz in Mexico. It was called Chinantla. And it's a fascinating community that has been in place for about 2,000 years plus. So they are in their ancestral lands. It's a long time. And so the entire human nature, non-dichotomy, but that entire relationship is deeply interwoven. And we went there to learn, like, how does this look? What does this look like? And as we were with our backpacks crossing this river, and the guide from the local community asked us to stop and to pay homage to a totem that was a rock with moss trickling down. Well, the water was trickling down the moss and kind of shaped a bit like a jaguar head. And he said, pedimos permiso para entrar, like we ask permission to enter here. Which happens a lot in many places around the world. You ask permission before entering, which I always do when I enter a forest, by the way. It's like, I don't just stumble into someone's home. It's like, can I be here, please, out of respect? So you ask permission to enter to this jaguar totem. And Norman, our teacher for this journey, was saying, well, why do you think the jaguar is the totem here? Like, why is this? This is, I guess, a version of indigenous embedded knowledge. Because the presence of the jaguar is a keystone species. And when the jaguar is there, and there's many keystone species in the natural world, which are essentially indicator species that show that a system is in a healthy state. So some may be frogs, like very sensitive amphibians, that if they're gone, you realize something's wrong. The presence of the jaguar points to the presence of a healthy ecosystem. And so for the people of La Chinantla, it's embedded in their mythos, right? And in their cosmology, but the jaguar is indicative of their healthy ecosystem. When they pay homage to the jaguar, they're paying homage to, like, may your presence please be here because our lives are interwoven into yours. Qualitative indicators, for me, are the part of seed that I'm really, really, really excited to get to when this more kind of technical science I've been alluding to is built. I'm kind of obsessed with this notion of, like, biocultural indicators for diversity, which point to human nature enmeshment or interactions. Because ecosystems and humans have flourished together for thousands of years. There's a million examples. Lila June, like I mentioned, has a whole thing called Architects of Abundance that you should check out or put in the notes, where she speaks about these mutualistic relationships between humans and other creatures for feeding and food. And so these biocultural practices, I believe, and many I'm sure would, point to forms of resilience that are embedded in an ecosystem that the other indicators I've been describing wouldn't capture. So for a long time, I've been obsessed with, like, sacred natural sites, which are often the living arcs of biodiversity on a dying planet, as they would say. So does this landscape have sacred natural sites? Does it have a native language that has embedded knowledge about the uses of the plants in its very utterance? Clothing, culture, is this whole kind of cultural aspect. And I think it would be what's really tricky is it's very hard to merge quantitative and qualitative indicators And I'll get to why the qualitative can have perverse outcomes, which Tom Crowther from our lab pointed out to me, which has made me pause. But I would love to find a way to bring those together so that you're not just looking at a patch of forest in Mexico and understanding its genetics and ecosystem diversity and species count, but you're also seeing the forms of human livelihoods that are enabling and enabled by that biodiversity, because that starts to go towards narrative and cosmology and transformation.
Mm-hmm.
One of the risks, which is quite interesting, I'd be curious for your thoughts, is the ecological variables can be scaled across entire landscapes. So you can kind of make a distributed map that's global. You can't do that with the qualitative indicators. Some places will have a natural site, some wouldn't.
Mm-hmm.
So if you give a rating to a place that has that language intact or a natural site, and you're weighting it heavier,
Mm-hmm.
would you then be penalizing places where there aren't that? Or would you then encourage a perverse incentive by which a community would maybe say, oh, yes, but we have this thing here, and so you kind of architect a fake thing. So
Mm-hmm.
again, the moment that you created an economic incentive system around something, it's going to be gamed.
Mm-hmm.
And so even with the qualitative indicators, it's very interesting to think how that could lead to certain places appearing to be less important because there's no one there, but it could be ecologically super rich and dense.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's also then points to a conversation about local governance, bioregional kind of funding disbursements relative to a global, fungible, market-driven approach to a lot of these conversations. And I think it's maybe also overlays nicely on the more transformational side of things than the triage and transition
Mm-hmm.
side of things. And so to me, it's an interesting inquiry to think about how does the tooling coax us from transition to transformation and create those natural pull mechanisms, incentives, whilst still addressing the important triaging that we need to do. And I also think that what you're pointing to me is very important as well in terms of an evolution of how we have understood conservation, where we've really, closed the gate, separate that wild space from the humans, and this biocultural, ecocultural approach where we are recognizing the enmeshed, interconnected, entangled relationship between humans and the rest of the living world.
Mm-hmm.
Is a part of that future that I think we want. And in that vein, you also paid tribute to E.O. Wilson, and the late E.O. Wilson, the famous ecologist who had the frame Half Earth. And, it points also to what just happened in Montreal, that we need to preserve 30% of land and oceans. Maybe we need to get to 50%. Justin Winters from One Earth kind of framed it as 50 by 50 as the next logical step. And you wrote that you would actually rather see it framed as whole Earth. Can you share more about that?
I think that Half Earth, even though it's a very useful framework, just the notion of half, it implies that there is a human thing and a nature thing.
Mm-hmm.
This is intractable. It's a paradox. I think we have to live with it. We are fundamentally different to nature in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
There is no doubt that humans have flung themselves out of the orbit that constrains other species, and it's possibly a little bit related to the recursive abstractions I spoke about earlier, and the way that our tool making exponentializes tech that exponentializes itself, and it, so we are fundamentally different creatures in some ways. And we also have a fundamentally different consciousness that can bind our behaviors in some ways, which is something that I'm deeply interested in. It's how we, at scale, really shift human education and behavior along those lines. But implying that nature has half and that we have half means that there's no ethics built into that necessarily of what we do with our half of the planet. And because every drop of water and every breath is related and will affect something else somewhere, what you do with every part of the earth matters to the whole, right? Like one of the favorite things that I do in some of my presentations when you spoke about the climate biodiversity dichotomy is I show a lot of different visuals of the ways that those two are related. And one of them is these blooms of plankton in the southern Antarctic oceans that produce about 60% of the clouds around the Antarctic Peninsula, because the plankton emit DMS, that's a little volatile gas, and then that particle goes up and it seeds the clouds. Every cloud needs a seed to start. And so these plankton are seeding the clouds are creating the system, etc. So, the Earth systems are so interrelated that we need to have a whole Earth perspective in terms of what we do, which I think is, speaking with this guy, Dan Hammer, who's trying to build this what do you call it? They essentially want to build like a Google Maps for understanding and querying the Earth's processes via satellite. So it's, how does everything, how can you see like the gases emitted here and how they're affecting this? So I would advocate for a whole Earth visual consciousness versus half-half. However, there are places that we should just allow the creatures to be themselves, because any road, any noise, any interference, and many IPLCs, local groups have this as well. There's just areas you don't go into.
You define IPLC?
Indigenous peoples and local communities. Sorry, acronym soup. There are areas they don't go into. And that's because our presence is disturbing in some places and not. So you can have these core protected zones, these kind of mixed use zones, and then urban zones. And, you can have a whole sort of gradient, if you will. That's how I think about it.
Yeah. I was down in Ecuador earlier this year, and we were with a community. And at one point, one of the tribal elders was pointing out different things in the landscape. And he said, over there, we don't go over there. That's for them.
Yes, yeah. Exactly. Exactly.
Okay, so SEED is developing comprehensive metrics for this challenge around measuring biodiversity, and obviously taking a number of considerations that we've spoken about into effect. And with Ground Effect, your Animist investment studio, I get the sense that you're also doing grants and investments alongside this movement to different companies, projects, nonprofits, et cetera. I am struck by, I would describe it as refreshing your approach to philanthropy and to investment. And from the interactions that we've had, it feels like you're bringing a dynamic and very alive lens to this space. So I wanted to ask just more of your philosophy and drivers and what you're seeing in that field.
I think that the best way to visualize what we support with Ground Effect, it's this Venn diagram of sort of biodiversity, or let's say Earth living systems. So everything from agriculture, soil, food, oceans, rewilding. It's all on the current website. But then again, through the Animist lenses, does this intervention bring us closer to life? Like you can maybe have we haven't invested in this specifically, but you can have like a soil sensor, or a weather sensor, if you will. But the whole UX and the design, one might enable fascination and connection and awe, and the other one might be very distancing. So does this bring us closer to some version of relationality? That's how we try to think about the biodiversity initiatives, as well as just supporting with protected areas and things like this. And also in the biodiversity piece, I will mention, and for the whole portfolio, I am only partly happy with it, because what I don't like is that, and I do think this happens a little bit in the space, we fund a lot of different projects that aren't necessarily connected to each other. And that means that space in between isn't being activated. It's like seeing the forest for the trees, but not for the infinite connections of what constitutes it. So I would love, and this is what I'm really working on in the next few years, for our portfolio to not be like a greenhouse, but like a forest, where it's not just lots of little plants and maybe they're like exchanging a few little volatile pheromones here in the air, but essentially they're not connected. So we're doing a first pilot project this year in Mexico with my dear friends from Mexico. They're a very cool family office. And we're creating a biodiversity systems map. So we've interviewed, over 50, 60 stakeholders all across biodiversity Mexico, any kind of actor you can imagine. You create the map, you understand the leverage points, the classic kind of Danella Meadows 101 stuff. And then from that, we will co-create and design with that community a series of interventions, which will be a whole blended finance vehicle, right? It'll be everything from capacity buildings and grants and maybe financial mechanisms to funds. But essentially, we will do our very best, and it will be forever imperfect, to support what biodiversity needs in Mexico with these synergistic projects, if you will, versus just one-offs here and there. And I would love for philanthropy and quote unquote impact investment to move into that space where I take what we're doing, you take what you're doing amazing stuff, right? As well. Like, and we say like, okay, where could these actually fit? Where could we build cohesion? And imagine if like 50 of us got together and did that and saw that we're maybe overlapping in areas, or that what you did with one a technical assistance facility here could benefit this. So for me, that's moving not even from like systemic investing, but to systems-based investing together. So specifically in biodiversity and or just nature protection, that's where I would love to move towards in investment. Then we are looking at new economic models, and that's trying to kind of distribute throughout all of our investments. Are we thinking differently about the term sheets of the venture funds? Are we thinking about, golden shares, exit to community, all of these purpose companies? Can it be owned by a foundation or a trust, et cetera? Are we decentralizing ownership, democratic decision making? I think we need to be way, way more radical and way more creative with how in every startup or fund we're pushing for that. So we've got a few investments like that now, but I think for me it's almost going to be, if a fund or a company isn't doing this, I'm not going to invest unless it's like a deeply critical, something has to happen. And then the last part is the one I really will be spending a lot of time on, and that's the most challenging, which is what I'm sort of calling earth consciousness or human wisdom. And that's essentially asking, what are the practices and approaches and modalities that have existed throughout time and also today to enable as many human beings as possible to understand a non-dual nature? What does that mean? I am you. I am everything I gaze upon, vice versa. The immigrant who will be moving due to climate refugees, etc. How do we not other? And that is a developmental thing that happens in our brains. At a certain point, we grow up, we individuate. But then culture used to have tools that would help us unindividuate again and be part of a collective. And I think in this current version of the system, it's like on crack. It's just like have us in these individualistic mindsets more than anything we've ever seen. And so how do we bring communities into this? With joy, with celebration, with reverence, with harvest fest. Like, this quote, like, I need a revolution I can dance to. It's like, ugh, so much of the movement is, of these different movements is, and it's maybe not a bad thing, but it's guilty or it's angry or and I believe that we need to elicit these core, deep human feelings. Like we need to get off the dopamine and expand the neurotransmitters that we're bringing people into, like, I was going to say oxytocin, but it is oxytocin, right?
Yeah, oxytocin.
Yeah. And just like, I think that we need to recreate these containers by which human beings come together with the earth and for the earth. So very practically, we're looking at programs we can fund in that space, education and retreats and things like this.
Do you have any other comments or visions to share about this transformation third pillar? And I get it that you're alluding to it with this earth consciousness. But yeah, anything else tugging at your heart?
I wonder if you don't just know it when you see it. Certain projects may look like something on paper, but then you go there or you meet the people behind it and something is different. And you can't measure it or quantify it. They are existing in some different mind frame, and everything that stems from that consciousness is colored or flavored with this essence. I think it often comes from non-fragmented humans or non-fragmented consciousness. I think that many things fragment us. When humans are more whole, and whatever this means, anything that stems from that has this quality of wholeness to it. And that dissipates itself throughout everything that's built. And so, yes, I could say there are programs I've seen or approaches that transform consciousness, and I do believe that this is true. But you can't tell it just by reading what they do. It's a felt thing. How have you felt that in your work? Where has that come up for you?
Well, I mean, as you speak that, it very much matches my recent experience with a project that's dear to my heart called the Learning Environment in Wanganui, New Zealand. And when you go to the land, I mean, I've just experienced multiple times, like there's something different that's happening here.
Mm-hmm.
It's in that kind of transformational bucket. And it's the kind of world I want to live in.
Well said.
And then I go back to philanthropic community. Look, let's fund this one. This is working.
Yeah.
And I'm asked things like cost per student metrics and challenges around a very valid but linear way of approaching the problem. And it's very hard to bridge the two.
Why does it work, what they're doing?
Only they can really speak for that, I think, eloquently. And, having visited the land and known some of the people, I have just different shards of experience. But I think a lot of it comes down to that wholeness, that recognition of wholeness, that approach, bringing our whole selves to the work. And there's just like a persistent thread of holism that I experience from a community of fairly young people that are doing radical acts of restoration and living together in these spaces. And there's lots of different, and that project, I'm sure they would be the first to say, it's no means perfect. There's always going to be the opportunities to improve. But I just really resonate with that frame of that we'll know it when we see it.
That made me think of something else, which is like, for me, transformation as a force feels like chemical, and it feels like it entails fire. It's kind of serotinous, and by the act of participating in the regeneration of life, you're burning away obscurities and you're burning away the BS that doesn't matter. And when I finished the first season of my podcast, I went back and listened to the interviews again and the notes, and I was like, what are the learnings here? And one of the key learnings that I heard across everyone was this notion that, by restoring the earth, we restore ourselves. And for me, whether it's, the ecosystem restoration camps that are set up, or the, Chicago Green Corps, which was an amazing example of inner city communities that had never had a connection with nature. They're brought to restore their parks or their rivers. Initially, they didn't have that connection. And then it becomes the most healing thing for them. And they're so proud. And then the parks are really... So kind of implicating humans in the restoration, the active participation of landscape, for me, full stop, that is transformation.
Yeah.
Anything that does this. I believe, not anything, but because it is, I think there's some part of us that is deeply desirous and innately hardwired to perform these acts of caring. When you think of what are humans here for? Why did nature doesn't, I don't think that Gaia, that nature, like Pachamama, whatever, this sentient organism that we're a part of, makes mistakes. I don't think we're a scourge on the earth. I don't think we're a virus. I don't think that, we need nature, but nature doesn't need us. Like, she's our mother. Like, a mother doesn't not want her kids, that she's, for me, it's this notion that I think human beings have an ability to witness beauty and create beauty from it in a way that some species do, but we do it incredibly well. Like, we witness something just exceptionally astounding, and we make music, dance, art from it. We create culture around it. And then that is like the earth witnessing itself in its beauty. Or we build a shrine in the forest, and the forest feels that, I believe. And then it's this aspect of being like conscious gardeners, I guess. We also are able to add to the richness and diversity of life by creating these ecological niches for even more species to thrive. And so I think that is fundamentally part of the conscious evolution that leads to us. And so for me, the transformation is like, can we get as many people out there to be doing these acts of restoration, because that will burn away. Michael Abelman, Soul Food Street Farms, also one of the episodes. People who had been living in downtown Vancouver and suffering from drug addiction and depression on the streets, they go to this farm. They never held a job for 2 months. They held a job for 13 years because they just had an honest role to put their hands in the dirt and make food. And so he saw so many people transform through doing this. So for me, transformation is maybe it's, I hadn't thought of it in this way, but I guess it's a very physical act that is about learning or just being in reciprocity.
Yeah, Ness Radich from the Learning Environment as well sums it up with heal the land and we heal ourselves, and vice versa, as an operating philosophy of the learning environment.
Yes.
Alexa, such a privilege to sit across from you and have this conversation. Do you have any other closing comments you'd like to share?
I'll say one. Maybe there's more than one, but one that comes to mind is our narratives are very anthropocentric. We need to fix the climate for human beings, even fix the climate, right? What a stupid sentence. In as much as the people who are listening are able to feel and embody the perspective of other beings, other life forms, life processes, it could be the wind, it could be water, it could be your dog, whatever. Can we inhabit the life worlds of other entities and learn to speak or feel on behalf of them and feel the world through their eyes and being, and tell a multiplicity of stories that isn't just ours? I think that the movement, I don't like it, the space that you and I work and operate in could really benefit from a much more interspecies dialogue and richness.
Alexa Firmenich.
Thank you.
All right, I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Alexa. You can learn more at alexafirmenich.com. To listen to her podcast, go to lifeworld.earth. We're putting links in the show notes for Crowther Lab, Seed Biocomplexity, as well as Ground Effect, her investment studio. You might also be interested in the conversation we did with Ayana Young about the age of loneliness. And on the topic of jaguars, we also had a conversation with Per Espen Stoknes, and he's recently begun work with Regen Network around jaguar eco-credits. Links are in the show notes. You can find all of our conversations at maearth.com. Please like, share, subscribe, tell your friends. We are a new channel and series. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you on the next one.